Now, from the WCCO Live Desk, you're watching CBS News Minnesota.
I'm Maria Lizignoli. Thanks for joining us at the Live Desk. Today, Human Rights Watch held a news conference to launch a new report that it says documents the U.S. federal government's unprecedented deployment of immigration forces to the Twin Cities and surrounding areas earlier this year. The nonprofit watchdog group says the report shows how federal agents engaged in widespread abuse during Operation Metro Surge. The news conference was held at the University of Minnesota Law School. Take a listen.
My team works to document some of the world's worst human rights abuses in armed conflicts and crisis situations all around the world, including in Iran, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Recently, Minnesota has also been a major focus of my team. Over the past 5 months, we've worked to investigate the far-reaching and widespread human rights violations and consequences of Operation Metro Surge, the unprecedented deployment of 4,000 federal immigration officers across the Twin Cities and surrounding areas between December and early March. We've now compiled these findings into a 180-page report we published today, which also includes over 40 discrete recommendations for federal and local officials, as well as international actors. I'd like to start by telling the story of one Minnesotan family originally from Honduras, whose experiences reflected the terror and abuse we heard about from so many people we interviewed, and which may sound familiar to many of you here with us today. 7-year-old Sophia, her little brother Gabriel, and their parents, Victor and Marta, were at their home in Minneapolis in early December. Suddenly, there's loud banging at the door. Before anyone can respond, it's smashed open. Around 15 armed and masked federal agents pour inside. No warrant, no explanation, just shouting, chaos, and sounds of the children crying. The agents grab the father, and within minutes, he's gone. Victor was held at an immigration detention facility in Texas. 3 weeks later, he was finally released and had to find his own way back home. When we first met this family in February, the impact of that arrest was still reverberating. The mom, Marta, was 8 months pregnant. She hadn't left the house since that terrifying day in December. Not for groceries, not for fresh air, not even to see her doctor as her baby's due date approached. Their 2 children hadn't stepped outside either. Sophia was trying hard to keep up with school online. She had wanted to become a lawyer in the United States. Now, she told us, she's too scared to stay in this country, and she needs to find a different dream. We spent weeks interviewing over 130 people, including families like Sophia's, activists, business owners, lawyers, doctors, construction workers, and teachers. We analyzed and reviewed dozens of videos and photos, sworn declarations, legal petitions, judicial decisions, ICE data, documentation by local human rights defenders, independent surveys, government data, and medical and public health records. Across the Twin Cities, we found the same story. People stopped, detained, and swept into an abusive system, often simply because of how they looked, often even when they were citizens or permanent residents. This racial profiling led many citizens of color to carry their passports with them whenever they left their homes. We found that ICE detained a total of around 4,000 immigrants during Metro Surge, over 75% of whom had no U.S. criminal convictions, and many of whom were detained unlawfully. Lawyers struggled to get access to many of the detainees, who were often held in inhumane conditions and quickly shipped off to other states, making them harder to track. But when they were able, lawyers rapidly filed habeas corpus petitions challenging these detentions. Nearly 90% of 532 cases resolved between December and mid-May resulted in orders for release, showing clearly that many of these arrests were blatantly unjustified. But Minnesotans did not sit by. People organized quickly to protest, document the abuse, and support their neighbors in a significant movement for human rights and civil liberties. And the response to this mobilization was swift and harsh. In the two cases that sparked national and international outrage, federal agents shot and killed U.S. citizens Renee Good and Alex Preddy. But those two unlawful killings were just the most visible edge of a violent system expanding its reach. We investigated the non-fatal shooting of another Minneapolis resident, Julio Cesar Sosa Salis, and the dozens of incidents where agents drew guns on people in their own neighborhoods, smashed car windows without justification, sometimes within a minute of approaching their vehicles, dragged people out of their vehicles, and physically threw or pushed people to the ground who were not resisting. We documented how agents repeatedly deployed less lethal weapons, such as chemical irritants and flashbang grenades, sometimes directly in people's faces and without warning, including against journalists. And as the National Lawyers Guild will speak to, they documented over 500 cases where U.S. citizen protesters were arrested during Metro Surge. Many protesters also experienced harassment, surveillance, and violence as they acted to prevent and stop these rights violations. And the goal of this wasn't just force, it was fear. And this time, that fear spread far beyond those who were directly targeted. People stopped leaving their homes, as we saw with Sophia and her family. Patients were too afraid to go to hospitals when they needed medical care. At some healthcare clinics, up to half of all appointments were canceled, even for essential and emergency treatment. Thousands of students missed school or had to join classes on Zoom. We rode along with the school superintendent in Fridley, who drove from school to school every morning, trying to keep her students safe as ICE vehicles were stationed on campuses, along bus routes, parked outside staff homes. People were afraid to drive to work and suffered wage and job losses, making it harder to pay rent and buy groceries. And the psychological toll was severe. Medical providers told us how fear, anxiety, and trauma had serious and likely long-lasting effects for mental health, especially for children. One provider told us about 3 teenagers who attempted suicide after their parents were detained. The consequences of this will likely be felt for years. And all of this fell hardest on people of color and immigrant families. People couldn't go to work, couldn't access food, couldn't live their lives. Entire communities withdrew from public life, terrorized by an operation designed and authorized at the highest levels of federal government. But the way Minnesotans responded to this crisis, including the vital work of Unidos, Advocates for Human Rights, the National Lawyers Guild, and many other partners, some of whom are with us today, made a real difference. Minnesotans joined together to protest, bear witness to human rights violations, and support each other. Thousands of people acted to protest abuses and protect people from racial profiling and violence. Minnesotans delivered food to families sheltering at home, raised funds for rent assistance, and built systems to support access to education and health care. And the public pressure contributed to real outcomes. Kristi Noem and Greg Bovino were pushed out of their previous roles. Operation Metro Surge was eventually drawn down in March, allowing people to begin returning to their lives. Sophia's baby brother was born in a hospital, and Sophia was able to return to school. And despite widespread fears to the contrary, we did not immediately see another operation like this deployed in another city. But this doesn't mean the risk is gone. systemic reforms and the public pressure needed to support them are more urgent than ever. This is especially true given the approval last week of around $70 billion to the Department of Homeland Security for ICE and Border Patrol, despite months of resistance and insistence on key reforms, as well as White House Border Czar Tom Homan's threat last week to surge ICE agents to New York. We also continue to hear about detentions by federal agents here in Minnesota. Many people continue to feel afraid, and the impacts on health, education, and work will take significant effort and time to heal. As a mental health advocate here in Minneapolis told us, Operation Metro Surge was a manufactured crisis with a very real, lasting, and traumatic impact. Urgent action is now needed at all levels of the U.S. government to stop the abuse and provide immediate relief to residents who had their access to healthcare, education, work, and food negatively impacted by the activities of Operation Metro Surge. Our report also calls for sweeping reforms to DHS and its component agencies of ICE and Border Patrol, including more robust oversight and accountability mechanisms. And we need to see serious, far-reaching, and well-resourced efforts to investigate all those with responsibility for abuse, including the 9 officials we name in our report, and to prosecute them where appropriate. This is essential to account for past abuses, to send the message that future abuse will not be tolerated, and to help prevent another large-scale crisis of this scale.
I am not a researcher, and I am not a lawyer. I am an immigrant, and I am an organizer. My job in this panel is not to give you more numbers, it's to help give you their meaning and the mandate that follows from them. Because the report has a title that tells you everything, a manufactured crisis. So let us be precise about what was manufactured. The slander that our Somali neighbors were founding terror, that was invented to justify what came next. 3,000 federal agents, the largest operation in the history of the department, they bragged. An occupation of the Twin Cities built on affection aimed at our own Attorney General said it plainly, not at safety, but at retribution. But you have just seen in this report what was not manufactured. The grief was not manufactured. Rene Good and Alex Purdy. Victor Diaz, who died in their custody, was not manufactured. The children doing schoolwork in hiding. The mothers held at the Whipple building denied a lawyer while a federal judge counted the court orders broken one after another after another. That was real. That was a crisis, and it was done to us by a government sworn to protect us. This report is the record. We must guard it. Now, the same week that we gathered to tell the truth, the government handed down its version. 94 pages, 15 names, and 2 words they could not stop using. One was conspiracy. The other one was propaganda. They look at neighbors writing, neighbors speaking, neighbors raising money for one another, neighbors photographing license plates so that a family could work and found a way for safety. And they called that propaganda. They called community defense a criminal enterprise. But read it closely. Read all 94 pages of it. Because it is not an indictment, it is a confession. In their own document, in their own words, they admit that ICE, and I quote them, boxed in. They admit the operation ended on February the 12th. They admit deportations failed when communities stood up. You do not write 94 pages about people who lost. You write 94 pages about people you fear. You are not prosecuting organizing. They're not prosecuting organizing because organizing failed. They are prosecuting it because organizing worked. Criminalization is a tribute that power pays to power. Put that finding next to the ones in this report because it belongs there. But a confession is meant to be heard. This indictment was meant to be watched because here's the older trick that power knows. When you do not want people to see your hand, you make them look somewhere else. They want our eyes in the courtrooms in Minnesota, the 94 pages, the 15 names, the spectacle of a trial, so that our eyes are not on the cages. So let us look at the cages. The people held at the Whipple building without a lawyer were only the near edge of a system that runs all the way to Texas and Louisiana. And inside that system, this is what the government's own records show. Last year, at least 30 people died in ICE custody, the deadliest year since 2004, deadlier than the worst year of the pandemic. Physicians for the Human Rights studied deaths like these and found 95% of them were preventable. And most of the people locked in those cages, nearly 3 out of 4, have never been convicted of any crime at all. They were not dangerous. They were sick. And they were ignored until they died. And then ICE issued a press release that called a human being an illegal alien who passed away. In this enforcement, is this enforcement or is this negligence with a body count? And the dying is not the worst of what happened behind those walls. For years, the Department of Homeland Security own Inspector General received tens of thousands of complaints of sexual abuse in immigration detention and investigated less than 1% of them. This year alone, Senator Offsal's investigation documented hundreds of credible reports of human rights abuse, dozens of cases of physical and sexual assault, pregnant women left to sleep on concrete floors. At a single facility in California in a single year, there were 7 reports of rape, and the private company that runs it to decide whether or not to investigate itself. And then there are the children. This summer, this government quietly ordered that every pregnant migrant girl in this custody be sent to one facility in one town in Texas, a facility it had barred for a year before for failing to care for pregnant children. More than a dozen girls, some of them 13 years old, at least half of them pregnant because they had been raped, sent on purpose to a state where they could not get the care they needed. 13 years old, pregnant from rape, warehoused by the same government that wants you to believe that the dangerous ones are in the neighbors who block the street to keep families safe. That is what the spectacle is for. Every headline about a conspiracy in Minneapolis is a headline that is not about a 13-year-old in Texas. The crisis they manufacture in our streets is the smoke. The cruelty they commit behind the wall is the fire. We will not be misdirected. We will name both. And I know what these charges are designed to do. They want to sort us, the good immigrant and the dangerous one, the protest they will tolerate and the one they will cage. I'm not here to endorse every tactic. I am here to say I will not sort my people for them. You do not have to agree with how someone resists an occupation to defend their right to resist. And an attack on the right to dissent is an attack on everyone in this room and beyond. So let me leave this panel with the sharpest thing I know to be true. Alice Walker named it, the most common way that people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So let us count what we have. They have organized money, we have organized people, and organized people beat organized money every time it has mattered in this country. They have a federal army. We have a movement that does not disband when the cameras leave. They have a Supreme Court clearing their path. We have the court of public opinion, and in that court, the people are the jury. They use their power to silence us. We use the Constitution to be free and to stay free. They did not end search on February 12th because they found mercy. They ended it because we stopped believing we were powerless and we found each other. And this very year, they will drape themselves in white, red, and blue, and they ask us to celebrate 250 years of America. So let us read them out. Let us read them, our own founding document. 250 years ago, a people declared independence from a government that, and these are their words, not mine, sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. a government that kept standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, a government that made the military superior to civil power, swarm of officers, standing armies sent to harass people. Tell me that is not the operation this report describes. Tell me King George is not wearing a different badge in the streets tonight. The founders called that tyranny, and they signed their names to resisting it. So I will not accept their accusations, not this year and not ever. They called us the criminals, but they pardoned 1,500 people who stormed the Capitol and then reached into public treasury to pay them. They called us violent, but they sent 3,000 armed agents into our neighborhoods and then left three of our people dead. They called us illegal aliens. They say we eat dogs. They branded our Somali neighbors terrorists. Every name they threw at us was a mirror. Every accusation was a confession. The lawlessness was never ours. The violence was never ours. We were the ones holding the Constitution. They were the ones breaking it. So to everyone in this room and listening, the researchers, the lawyers, the organizers, the free press, this report is the evidence. Now let us be the verdict. In this 250 years, let us be clear about which side of that founding promise we stand on. They have the army, we have the people. They have the pardons, we have the truth. And now we have it in writing. They manufacture a crisis, we are architecturing a movement. When they send their swarms, we send each other. And when they write 94 pages to frighten us into silence, we read it out loud together, and then we go and organize. This country does not get to turn 250 years and call itself free until it's finally worth the people it keeps trying to erase. So my message against those who use political repression is this. We will be standing here together long after the swarms are gone. This is how Minnesota answered. This is how America will continue to answer. And this is how a country finally become worth its 250 years. Thank you.
For years, we have relied on reports by Human Rights Watch to document our clients' claims for asylum from persecution as they seek safety in the United States. These reports provided critical context and evidence for the testimony of people who have fled for their lives because of who they are or what they believe. And it is tremendously sobering to find our own community the subject of a Human Rights Watch report. During Operation Metro Surge, federal authorities used serious human rights violations. They were not accidents. They used serious human rights violations, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, some of the most chilling and potent human rights violations there, to terrorize Minnesota's immigrant and refugee communities. These violations resulted in real harm to real people, to individuals, their families, to our colleagues, our staff, our clients, our friends, our comrades. And they also created real costs to our community as a whole. I think the city of Minneapolis just put a dollar value on that. Throughout this, the advocates for human rights did join so many in our legal community to challenge those abuses in the courts. In one case, we were able to stop the illegal arrest, detention, and transportation out of state of refugees who are lawfully here in the United States. Challenges could work. Some of those cases are ongoing. Many, many more couldn't be filed in time. And today, alongside the Binger Center for New Americans and the National Immigration Project, we're running the Minnesota Habeas Project, where dozens of calls continue to come in every week. Right? But as the events of this past week make clear, Operation Metro Surge was not simply about mass deportations. Late last week, federal authorities raided a voting rights organization throughout Ohio, seizing electronic devices, showing up at workers' homes, following them to where they dropped their children off from school, using the playbook of Metro Surge in a new way. Meanwhile, federal authorities demanded access to immigration legal service providers' offices throughout the Washington, D.C. area, going after people like us who provide free legal help to children facing deportation alone. And of course, as Amelia just so eloquently talked about, indictments were leveled against people for civil action. Operation Metro Surge was an attack on Minnesota's immigrants and refugees, but it was also a warm-up for a broader attack on civil society. That is what it's meant to do. Human Rights Watch's clear-sighted documentation is essential as we seek accountability and try to ensure that these violations are not further weaponized in the United States.
The next question is, what do we do about it, right? And so one of the things that we're doing about it here in Minnesota is that the governor has signed an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Recording the Truth of Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris. The Minnesota Truth Council is how it's known. And the mandate of the Minnesota Truth Council is to document the full story of what happened here in Minnesota, both the human rights violations and the incredible things that Minnesotans did individually and collectively to step up and support their neighbors. And also to make recommendations for how we reform and how we recover as a state and as a nation. For every individual that Human Rights Watch was able to interview, there are hundreds, if not thousands more who have a story to share. So the Truth Council and the advocate's role as implementing partner is to create the opportunities to collect those stories. So for now until December 1st, we have an open voluntary process to collect stories either anonymously or publicly, and we would encourage everyone to share their story with us about what they experienced. So you can share your story individually by contacting us at the advocates or the website, minnesotatruthcouncil.org. That's MNTRUTHCOUNCIL.org. You can, as a community organization, you can sign up to partner with us to create a story collection process within your own community organization. You can view or attend a public meeting. We anticipate that the public meetings will take place late summer and early fall, and so the Truth Council will be working on planning those through the summer. And you can read the report, which will be presented to the legislature on December 1st. So this, again, to emphasize, this is an independent, nonpartisan, victim-centered, and community-led. And again, huge shout out to the community organizations who are here today and also not here today, who are involved in developing the process, but also are involved in getting the word out to do this documentation. And this is our chance to tell our story here in Minnesota. It is not a court. It's not an investigative and prosecution process. That still needs to happen, and so that is we still have a lack of accountability here in the U.S., and so that will happen separately. But encourage everyone to get involved and to share your story.
On Tuesday, the Trump administration took another step in their rapid descent towards full-throated fascism. The Department of Justice announced indictments against 15 Minnesotans, my neighbors, my union siblings, my religious studies professor from college, for daring to stand up to the machinations of the Trump administration. This is a deliberate act of political repression intended to chill dissent. Political repression does not happen in a vacuum. We must be clear about what happened in Minnesota to precipitate this repression. We must be clear about what our neighbors were standing up against. Federal agents descended upon the state of Minnesota, hell-bent on a project of racial terror. They manufactured consent for this invasion with violent, dehumanizing rhetoric towards our Somali neighbors. Their leaders, Greg Bavino among others, raised Nazi salutes in our streets. If you were black or brown or dared to speak Spanish, Hmong, or Somali, you had a target on your back. My neighbors in Minnesota saw this project of racial terror for what it was and stood up to stop it. And in turn, my neighbors have faced the full weight of this repressive regime. The Trump administration will stop at nothing to achieve their violent, racist, and fascist goals. They would violate every known principle of international human rights law. They would arrest hundreds of U.S. citizen observers exercising their First Amendment rights. They would kill Renee Good and Alex Preddy, all to ensure their unilateral ability to sow racial terror against Black and brown immigrant communities. This is their project. This is what we faced, and this is what 15 of my neighbors have been criminalized for resisting. The Minnesota chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, alongside the tens of thousands of neighbors who stood up in the face of this violence, played a small role in this struggle. We are not unfamiliar with state repression. We proudly boast that the National Lawyers Guild has stood up to fascism since our founding in 1937. But even we have been alarmed by the brutality of this federal occupation. The National Lawyers Guild operates a protest support hotline. During the peak of Operation Metro Surge, we received over 100 calls a day. For each call, our volunteers are tasked with gathering information to effectively triage an arrest. The volume and intensity of the violence made that routine task difficult. It was not an uncommon experience for our hotline volunteers to only learn the identity of the arrestees when someone stumbled upon a smashed out, abandoned car and found their insurance cards inside. In Minneapolis, cars loitering on the side of the road, windows shattered, occupants disappeared, became a routine sight. For the first time, we have now released the data that reveals the full scope of ICE abuse. In full, the National Lawyers Guild documented at least 245 arrests of U.S. citizen observers by federal agents. Not to be outdone, state and local law enforcement arrested at least 279 U.S. citizens for protest during Operation Metro Surge. I will note, for the record, that this is likely to be a systematic and dramatic undercount of the number of arrests. I encourage everyone to review our methodology, which is discussed in greater detail in the Human Rights Watch report. The vast majority of these individuals were brought to the Bishop Whipple Federal Building, where they were routinely subjected to neglect and abuse. Arrestees were denied access to counsel and medical care. Without warrants, ICE agents searched and seized the locked cell phones of hundreds of arrestees. Our lawyers described the Whipple building as a war zone, where ICE agents mounted up before launching incursions into our community. Amidst this chaos, untrained ICE officers used sticky notes to designate which cells held U.S. citizens and which cells held immigrant detainees. In many cases, your citizenships did not matter. Multiple U.S. citizens, as well as enrolled tribal members, were held in immigration detention purely due to the color of their skin. The point of these arrests was never to ensure public safety nor achieve any legitimate law enforcement end. ICE arrested observers and protesters as a brazen act of political repression to chill dissent. The local U.S. Attorney's Office have furthered this chilling effect. They have aggressively prosecuted hundreds of these cases. As of today, we have documented over 153 cases, individuals with federal crimes for their actions to resist the ICE occupation. An additional 232 cases have been prosecuted in state criminal court. Altogether, nearly 400 people in the state of Minnesota are facing criminal charges as a result of Operation Metro Surge. Of course, prosecutorial aggression is not a substitute for prosecutorial competence. From the beginning, the vast majority of these vindictive political prosecutions have crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been sanctioned for willfully misrepresenting the facts and the law in the court and violating judicial orders. As a result, over half of the federal cases brought by the Trump administration have been dismissed. In many ways, the impropriety of these prosecutions is best summed up by members of the federal bench themselves. In a federal felony case that was recently dismissed by the Honorable John Thunheim, court ruled that, quote, in short, the government's actions in this case violated a court order, likely violated the Department of Justice's own policies, and undermined the presumption of innocence that lies at the heart of our criminal justice system. For these reasons, the court concludes that the dismissal with prejudice is necessary to protect the defendant from prosecutorial harassment. Prosecutorial harassment has become the norm in our district. We must not let it become normalized. We have witnessed tepid efforts to reform fail to rein in the abuses of ICE. But a project of racial terror cannot be reformed. The National Lawyers Guild demands the complete and total abolition of ICE. We demand the release of all people in immigrant detention. We demand amnesty for all individualized, criminalized for resisting ICE activity. Now, more than ever, the rule of law hangs in the balance. All of us here, lawyers, journalists, human rights researchers, the press writ large, have a role to play in this fight ahead. May we do so with the courage of Minnesotans.
Generally, they fall into three categories around accountability, structural reforms, and investments in communities for the future as a remedy. We have 40 specific recommendations in the report. They are federal, state, and international. With respect to federal recommendations, they are recommendations to Congress, to the executive, and specifically to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. We call for things like reinstituting and reinforcing monitoring, transparency, oversight, and accountability mechanisms that have been dismantled or that have not existed with specific regard to immigration enforcement and detention. We recommend investigations and criminal prosecutions of bad actors, including the 9 we name in senior leadership and multiple others. We recommend the complete overhaul of the Department of Homeland Security. We demand that sensitive locations guidance be legislated so that children and people are protected at hospitals, at church, at school, etc. And we also recommend that racial profiling in immigration enforcement, like everywhere else, should be prohibited. On the state level, we recommend that there be an investigation of the surveillance used by DHS agents throughout the Operation Metro Surge. We recommend banning of 287G agreements and all the implications that those agreements mean for many, many counties and communities across the state. We recommend that the state refrain from arresting people for exercising protected human rights that they have, including the right to free speech. We recommend refraining from using unwarranted force against protesters. We recommend that states and local jurisdictions create and reinforce state accountability mechanisms for the Operation Metro Surge actions and violations. And finally, we strongly recommend that state and local communities invest in the future of communities, in public services to remedy the harms of Operation Metro Surge, like education harms, health harms, housing, and other business impacts.
We will continue following this new report that Human Rights Watch says shows how federal agents engaged in widespread abuse during Operation Metro Surge. Look for updates in our later newscasts, streaming on CBS News Minnesota and online at WCCO.com.